Welcome. Equality is a key American value, and yet equality has often been far from the reality. There is probably no movement more associated with the American pursuit of equality than the Civil Rights Movement, often simply called the movement by its protagonists. In truth, there is no single place to begin, but the 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, was the first in a series of significant developments over the following decade, culminating in the 24th Amendment and in the Civil Rights Act, both of which date to 1964. So, today, we'll cover this crucial decade and the profound legal and cultural changes that it engendered. It started simply enough. In 1951, Oliver Brown, a resident of Topeka, Kansas, wanted to enroll his daughter at the local public school. But the school district refused. He sued, and in 1954, the case came before the Supreme Court. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled in Brown's favor. In this, it began the process of overturning the ruling in its 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed for segregation under the now discredited idea of separate but equal. In and of itself, the outcome of Brown v. Board of Education was not wholly out of step with developments elsewhere in the United States. In fact, by 1954, a small but steady number of school districts had already begun desegregating. But with the issue now decided by the nation's highest court, there was a sharp backlash against desegregation and a corresponding increase in racist violence. Resistance was so extreme that some proposed abolishing such requirements as school attendance. Still others proposed closing schools instead of integrating them. But of course, none of this was practical. The extremes suggested by some for maintaining segregation thus gave way to flat-out extremism. But in fact, the relationship between the Civil Rights Movement and Brown v. Board of Education is actually indirect, or perhaps better, it's a mediated relationship. The outcome of the case saw both forcible integration and violent protest, and this, in turn, led to an increased refusal to abide segregationist laws. One of the most horrific incidents of racist violence occurred in 1955, the year after Brown, when Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy, was lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Pictures of his mutilated body were widely circulated, and they inspired Rosa Parks several months later to refuse to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. And the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 soon gave rise to a broader movement. Central here was a young Baptist pastor, Martin Luther King, Jr. He had a twofold strategy: direct action. This involved active disruption through something like a protest march, but no less importantly, it then required the protesters to commit to nonviolence when subjected to reprisals, and this even when they were beaten. Some of the most vivid examples of this came in 1961, when civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, were attacked by police dogs, and children were targeted with fire hoses. Pictures and stories of such abuse circulated across the country, slowly but surely changing hearts and minds. Perhaps most importantly, President John F. Kennedy, who had largely waffled on civil rights until then, came around to support it. It's common enough to emphasize the ideals of those who participated in the civil rights movement. But although popular sentiment is now firmly on their side, it's easy to forget that, then as now, popular demonstration only counts for so much. The power for change is primarily in the hands of government officials. And during the civil rights movement, government officials dealt not just with domestic demonstrations, but with international perceptions. Put somewhat differently, government support for civil rights was also about fighting the Cold War. Consider the following. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, half of the Soviet Union's anti-American propaganda focused on American racism and segregation. And when the United States urged the Soviet Union to hold free elections, the Soviet Union responded that the United States had no right to make any such demand, for by disenfranchising so many blacks, the United States had also failed to hold its own free elections. By the early 1960s, decolonization was happening across the globe as the remaining European empires, most notably the British Empire, collapsed. Newly independent, post-colonial nations were seeking new international allies, which meant that the Soviet Union and the United States had to compete with one another for these allies. But with African Americans treated so badly, and with the Soviets exploiting American racism, the United States needed to change its image abroad. But the only way to do this was to change its own legal framework. And so it did. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 brought together diverse streams. The push for civil rights came from multiple directions, and it included groups that shared the same end goal, but sometimes disagreed about the means. Consider the 1963 March on Washington, which is best known today because that's when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. The NAACP, for example, initially opposed the march, not least because it disagreed with King's advocacy of direct action. But the March on Washington proved a success, and it led to a watershed in civil rights proposals. President Kennedy soon introduced the first version of his Civil Rights Act, but his assassination in November 1963 means that he did not live to see it pass. But the bill that was ultimately ratified was also about much more than race, and it touched upon more than ending Jim Crow. It banned a very large variety of discriminatory practices in the workplace, in housing, and guaranteed equal access to businesses. Many things quite literally changed overnight, and there are numerous stories of American citizens being denied service in segregated businesses one day, but then being served the next. And if you dig into its detailed history, you find that the Civil Rights Act cut across many lines of division, including those that later hardened as the United States grew increasingly polarized. According to Clay Risen, in his book The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act, the civil rights movement was a culture of protest, but also of civic engagement, one that brought together black and white, secular and religious, young and old, conservative and liberal, a culture that would reverberate even as it fractured through the 1960s and beyond. A remarkable amount of violence threads all of these developments. Civil rights demonstrators were subjected to the harshest treatment, sometimes by agents of the law, and sometimes by private citizens and citizen groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, which adopted terrorist tactics in their bid to maintain Jim Crow. For example, the KKK burned and bombed churches, such as Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. This is among the most infamous incidents of domestic terrorism during the civil rights movement, because it resulted in the death of 4 little girls. And, as is well known, more death followed. In retrospect, President Kennedy's assassination presaged the uglier political turns witnessed in the later 1960s. Violence escalated across the entire political spectrum, and for any number of reasons. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 by a member of his former religious group, the Nation of Islam. Robert F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, was assassinated in 1968 by a Palestinian American in protest of American support for Israel. But the most well-known assassination in the late 1960s United States is probably that of Martin Luther King, Jr. A fugitive, James Earl Ray, was convicted of the crime. All of these assassinations have spawned any number of conspiracy theories. But the King family has never accepted that Ray worked alone. The truth may never be known, but what matters here is that violence begets violence, and civil rights demonstrators bore the brunt of it.
So what?
All of this had an effect upon the American Constitution. On January 23, 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified. It was proposed by Spessard Holland, a senator from Florida and a former governor of the state. In some ways, Holland's own life and career can be seen as emblematic of larger shifts in American society. Sometimes described as a progressive conservative, he initially supported segregation, and he deeply opposed the outcome of Brown v. Board of Education. In fact, he was one of the signatories of the Southern Manifesto, a public declaration in 1956 by numerous Southern lawmakers. The manifesto rejected the Brown ruling, and it opposed racial integration. But less than a decade later, Senator Holland had clearly embraced a very different view. And, thus, he proposed the abolition of voting poll taxes. The first poll tax was enacted in Florida in 1889, and other former Confederate states rapidly adopted the practice as their own. The tax was not high, but it was high enough that it effectively prevented the poor from voting. And, since a disproportionate number of Black Americans were poor, the 24th Amendment had the greatest effect upon the descendants of former slaves. It reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for President or Vice President, for electors for President or Vice President, or for Senator or Representative in Congress, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax." And, as with other amendments ratified since Reconstruction, the 24th Amendment concludes by stipulating, "The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." We can read the 24th Amendment alongside the Civil Rights Act, which passed just a few months later. And then, 1965 saw the Voting Rights Act, which was passed to enforce the 15th Amendment by banning any practice that would abridge the right of citizens to vote. These are vitally important developments, but they also bring with them an important upshot. These laws also show us that American democracy, at least as practiced today, only dates to the mid-1960s. And this means that American democracy is, in many ways, a very young political system. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. For a general overview of the civil rights movement, read The Movement, The African American Struggle for Civil Rights by Thomas C. Holt. It's a concise overview that not only focuses on well-known figures and events, but on those less known but no less important. Next, school integration is the focus of Michael Klarman's book, Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement. It's an engaging and sometimes surprising study, partially condensed and revised from his award-winning larger book, From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equity. Finally, an excellent overview of the Civil Rights Act can be found in Clay Risen's study, The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act. It's a detailed deep dive into both the cultural and legal history of the bill that Risen persuasively describes as the most important piece of legislation passed by Congress in the 20th century. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.